Liam Hart, a battle-scarred veteran still haunted by PTSD, was walking his loyal German Shepherd Rex along the foggy back trails of Silver Creek when something unthinkable happened. Rex suddenly froze, ears pricked, then bolted toward the riverbank, barking louder than Liam had ever heard before. Confused, Liam chased after him, and that's when he saw it. A soaking wet burlap sack caught on the roots by the creek's edge, rocking gently with the current. At first, Liam thought it was just trash, until the sack moved. Heart pounding, he knelt down, reached for it, and then, through the roar of the river, he heard it, the faintest broken whisper, "Mama." From that moment on, nothing in Liam's life, or this little girl's, would ever be the same. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in miracles. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far this story of hope and second chances can reach. The morning in Silver Creek was a hard and bitter cold, the kind of cold that bit at the lungs and turned every breath into a white veil against the gray sky. Liam Hart, now 45 years old, trudged along the winding path that hugged Miller's Creek with his German Shepherd Rex at his side. Liam was tall, his shoulders still carrying the square frame of a soldier, but his body was worn, his gait carrying the stiffness of too many nights without rest. His dark hair, streaked with strands of silver, was cut close but unkempt, and a trimmed beard covered a face lined with years of strain. His eyes, once sharp and focused, now held a faraway haze, as if the man looking out from behind them never truly stood in the present moment. Those who knew him in town described him as polite but distant, a man who would nod but rarely linger in conversation, and who avoided the warmth of company because warmth reminded him too much of what he had lost. Liam's past clung to him like the shadows at twilight. He had served nearly 2 decades in the army, including long tours in Afghanistan, where the sound of gunfire and the screams of comrades became as ordinary as the desert winds. It was there that he lost more than fellow soldiers. He lost the part of himself that once believed in peace. And when he returned home, he also lost the family that had promised to wait for him. His wife, weary of living with the fragments of a man plagued by nightmares and silent rages, had left, taking their daughter with her. Years had passed, but the ache remained. He lived now in a small wooden cabin on the edge of Silver Creek, alone except for Rex, the only soul who stayed when everyone else had walked away. Rex was 5 years old, a German shepherd bred for discipline but softened by devotion. His thick black and tan fur stood out starkly against the pale snow, his amber eyes bright and alert. Muscular and strong, Rex carried himself with the proud bearing of a working dog. Yet his loyalty to Liam was absolute. He had served once in training exercises for the military, but had never gone overseas. Instead, he became Liam's unofficial companion after the war, sensing every tremor of his master's broken spirit. When Liam jolted awake at night, drenched in sweat and gasping from dreams of fire and explosions, Rex would place his head gently against his chest until the rapid beating of his heart slowed. The dog was more than a pet. He was a tether, keeping Liam from drifting entirely into the abyss. The creek was sluggish that morning, its waters partly frozen along the edges, the current carrying patches of ice downstream. Liam carried a thick wool coat buttoned high at the neck, his gloved hands shoved deep into the pockets, his breath puffing in ragged bursts. He walked the path out of routine, because the rhythm of his boots crunching against frozen soil was the only music that kept him moving through days otherwise filled with silence. He walked to remind himself he was still alive, though sometimes he wondered why. Each step was a battle against the thoughts that whispered he had already lost the war. Rex trotted ahead, his paws leaving neat prints in the snow, his nose twitching as he caught scents along the water's edge. Every so often he glanced back, ears pricked, making sure Liam followed. The connection between them was unspoken but fierce. Liam had once read that dogs could smell chemical changes in the human body, triggered by fear or despair. He believed it, because Rex always seemed to know when the darkness inside Liam swelled too heavy to carry. This morning, Liam's mind wandered back to the desert. The snow and cold could not erase the echo of sand and smoke, of comrades bleeding out in his arms, of the desperate sound of radio static when help never came. He tried to shake it off, muttering to himself, but the images persisted like scars carved beneath the skin. He was so lost in his thoughts that at first he barely noticed Rex stiffen. The dog's ears shot up, tail rigid, and a low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Then Rex barked, a sharp and urgent sound that cut through the stillness of the morning. Liam blinked, startled, his hand tightening on the leash though Rex had already pulled forward. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, his throat catching as if words were stones too heavy to speak. Rex barked again, more insistent, and lunged toward the bank of the creek. Liam followed, his boots sliding on the icy ground, his heart suddenly racing without knowing why. The creek gurgled faintly, water slapping against branches that jutted from the bank. At first, Liam saw nothing unusual, just the half-frozen stream, the dull shapes of logs and weeds caught along the edges. Then his eyes caught on it. A burlap sack, sodden and heavy, tangled among the roots of a willow tree, leaning low over the water. It rocked gently with the current, bumping against the roots, water dripping steadily from its edges. At a glance, it could have been nothing more than discarded feed, the kind farmers sometimes tossed aside without care. But something about it made Liam pause. The sack shifted, not from the water's flow, but from within. A faint movement, almost imperceptible, sent ripples across the surface. Rex barked furiously now, pawing at the ground, his body taut with urgency. Liam's breath hitched, and a cold that had nothing to do with winter seeped into his bones. He took a step closer, snow crunching beneath his boots, his eyes fixed on the bundle. His mind swirled with questions, dread rising like smoke in his chest. He thought of trash, of animals, of something trapped. But deep down, he knew. His gloved hand trembled as he reached toward the sack, the sound of the creek filling his ears, mingling with the thunder of his heartbeat. The weight of memory pressed on him. Soldiers trapped under rubble, comrades gasping for help, the helplessness of arriving too late. This time, he told himself, he would not be too late. The sack shifted again, and Liam froze, standing on the edge of a discovery that would change everything. The icy air clung to Liam's lungs as he crouched by the creek, his breath rising in uneven clouds, his gloved hands trembling above the soaked burlap sack. Rex stood close, body tense, ears pinned back, his low growl rumbling like distant thunder. Slowly Liam reached down, fingers tightening around the wet, coarse fabric, and dragged the heavy bundle onto the frozen bank. His boots slipped slightly on the damp ground, and his heart pounded in his chest like the echo of distant artillery. The sack was heavier than he expected. Water streamed from its seams, leaving dark stains across the frost-bitten grass. With his breath caught in his throat, he tugged at the knotted rope sealing the opening. It resisted at first, soaked and stiff, but after a sharp pull, the knot loosened, and Liam carefully peeled the sack open. Inside was a small girl, no older than 3, curled tightly into herself, as though clinging to life by sheer instinct. Her messy blonde hair clung in damp strands to her pale, almost bluish skin, and her tiny lips were tinged purple from the cold. In one frail arm, she clutched a small threadbare rag doll against her chest, its fabric worn and faded, the single button eye hanging by a thread. Liam's breath hitched, his entire body froze, his mind caught between disbelief and terror. Rex sniffed at the edge of the sack, his nose twitching rapidly before letting out a soft, high-pitched whine, as though sensing the fragility of the little figure inside. Hey, it's okay," Liam murmured softly, his voice hoarse, unfamiliar even to himself. His fingers trembled as he reached in, gently sliding his hands under the girl's tiny body. She was ice cold, so light it felt as though he was lifting nothing but a wisp of breath. The girl stirred faintly, eyelids fluttering, and her dry, cracked lips parted to form the softest whisper, barely audible against the sound of the creek. "Mama!" The sound shattered him in ways he didn't expect. The echo of a memory stabbed through his chest. His own daughter's voice, years ago, when she had still called him Daddy before everything fell apart. He clenched his jaw, forcing the thought away. Now wasn't the time for ghosts. Pulling her close to his chest, Liam stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it tightly around her tiny frame. "Hold on, little one," he whispered, pressing her against his body to share what warmth he could. Rex circled anxiously, barking once, sharply, then stood alert, watching the woods around them as though expecting danger. Liam held the girl tighter, adjusted the coat around her, and with a grunt of effort, pushed himself up to his feet. Without a second thought, he started toward the path leading back to town, his boots crunching loudly against the frozen ground. The journey back felt longer than it was, every second stretching under the weight of the fragile life in his arms. Rex trotted alongside him, occasionally glancing up at the bundle, his soft whines breaking the silence. Liam's jaw was tight, his breath sharp, his mind racing through 1,000 thoughts and none at all. By the time the first outlines of Silver Creek came into view through the trees, his shoulders ached, his chest burned, but he didn't slow down. The town's small medical clinic sat at the edge of Main Street, a squat white building with a faded red cross painted above the door. Liam didn't often come here. The last time had been years ago when a cracked rib from a bar fight forced him inside. But today, the urgency burned away any hesitation. Bursting through the door, he startled the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and wire-framed glasses perched low on her nose. "I need the doctor," Liam barked, his voice deep and raw. "Now." Within seconds, Dr. Michael Stone appeared from an adjoining room, wiping his hands on a towel. Dr. Stone, in his early 50s, was a tall man with a sturdy frame, thinning brown hair, and lines etched deeply across his forehead, the kind that came from years of sleepless nights and hard decisions. He wore a pale blue button-down under his white coat, the cuffs slightly rolled up, and his sharp green eyes were quick to scan the situation. A man known for his calm authority, Dr. Stone had served in a field hospital during the early 2000s before returning home to Silver Creek. Those who knew him described him as compassionate but blunt, a man who didn't waste words when lives were on the line. "What happened?" Dr. Stone asked, his voice clipped, already gesturing toward the examination table. "Found her by Miller's Creek, in a sack," Liam said, his throat tightening around the words as he gently laid the bundled girl on the padded table. Dr. Stone leaned over the child, his movements precise and practiced. He checked her pulse, opened her mouth to examine her airway, and quickly placed a stethoscope to her chest. After a tense moment, he exhaled softly. "Weak pulse, shallow breathing, early hypothermia," he muttered under his breath, reaching for a warmed blanket from a nearby shelf. As he worked, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, Grace Harper. Grace, 34 years old, was a school teacher at Silver Creek Elementary, slender with a quiet, graceful presence. Her chestnut brown hair was tied back in a simple braid, a few loose strands framing her pale, soft-featured face. Her hazel eyes, warm yet shadowed with unspoken grief, locked on the tiny figure lying on the table. Grace had lost her husband 5 years earlier in a mining accident that took half the lives of Silver Creek's workers in one tragic afternoon. Since then, she had withdrawn from much of the social chatter in town, finding solace in her classroom and her books. She was gentle, patient, and known among her students for her soft-spoken kindness, though behind closed doors, loneliness lingered like a quiet ghost. "What happened?" she asked softly, her voice cracking slightly as she moved closer to the table. "Found her in the creek," Liam replied, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic, as though he'd failed to protect the little girl sooner. Dr. Stone looked up, his expression tight but controlled. "We need to warm her up slowly. If she goes into shock, it'll get worse. Grace, can you help me?" Grace nodded immediately, setting her bag down and stepping beside him. She leaned over the child, her slim hands working carefully to adjust the warmed blanket, her voice soothing as she whispered reassurances the girl was too weak to hear. Rex sat just inside the doorway, watching intently, his ears twitching at every small sound, his large body unusually still, as though even he sensed how fragile this moment was. Minutes passed in heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the shallow breaths of the child. Finally, Dr. Stone stepped back slightly and nodded. "She's stabilizing," he said, his voice softening. "We'll need to monitor her temperature and hydration levels for the next few hours." Grace glanced at Liam, her hazel eyes wide and uncertain. "Does she have a name?" Liam shook his head slowly, his throat tight. "Not one she could tell us," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the little girl's small, pale face. Grace looked down at the tiny hand clutching the doll and brushed a damp lock of hair from the girl's forehead. "Then maybe we should give her one," she murmured softly, almost to herself. After a pause, she whispered, "Hope. She deserves that." Liam stared at Grace, something shifting deep within him at the sound of the word. He repeated it under his breath, almost testing the shape of it in his mouth. Hope! For the first time in years, the name felt like something solid to hold on to, fragile but real. The snow in Silver Creek had stopped, but the cold lingered in the air, thick and heavy like unspoken secrets. Liam sat in the corner of the small clinic room, his elbows resting on his knees, his calloused hands clasped tightly together. The little girl, Hope, lay on the padded table, bundled in heated blankets, her breathing slow but steady now. Rex, the 5-year-old German shepherd, lay at Liam's feet, his ears twitching occasionally, amber eyes fixed on the door as though he sensed something approaching. Grace Harper sat beside the table, softly humming an old lullaby as she gently stroked Hope's damp blonde hair, her hazel eyes filled with quiet determination. The clinic door creaked open and Sheriff Paul Williams stepped inside. Williams, a man in his late 50s, carried the weight of the town's troubles on his broad, sturdy shoulders. His gray-streaked hair was cropped short beneath his worn Stetson hat, and deep lines carved into his sun-weathered skin told the story of decades spent enforcing laws in a place where everyone knew each other's business. His uniform, though faded from years of service, was neatly pressed, and a polished silver badge gleamed on his chest. Known for his fairness and quiet patience, Williams had spent 30 years serving Silver Creek, but behind his steady brown eyes was a man hardened by loss. His wife had passed 5 winters ago, leaving him to live alone with his grown son stationed overseas. "Liam," Williams said gravely, his deep voice low and steady, "we need to talk." Liam straightened, his jaw tightening instinctively. Grace looked up from Hope, her brow furrowing with concern. "What is it, Sheriff?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the steadiness Liam lacked in that moment. Williams glanced at the small girl before closing the door behind him. He took off his hat and ran a hand over his thinning hair, exhaling heavily. "Word spreading in town," he began. "Someone's offering a reward, a big one, for information about a missing child." Liam's shoulders stiffened, his blue-gray eyes darkened beneath the weight of suspicion. "Missing child?" he repeated slowly, though his gut already told him where this was headed. Williams nodded, stepping closer. "I did some digging. There's no official report filed anywhere in the county or beyond. No Amber Alert. Whoever's looking for this little one is keeping it quiet, and that worries me more than if they had gone through proper channels." Grace's hand froze mid-motion on Hope's hair. "Why would they keep it quiet?" she asked, her voice faint. The sheriff hesitated, his gaze falling briefly before meeting Liam's again. "Because it involves people who don't want their names dragged into this. People with power." Before Liam could respond, a gentle knock sounded at the door. The receptionist poked her head in, her expression strained. "Sheriff, there's a woman here asking for you," she said quietly. "She says it's urgent." Williams nodded once. "Send her in." A moment later, Maria Gonzalez entered the room, her posture tense, her dark coat wrapped tightly around her. Maria was in her early 40s, a petite woman with olive-toned skin, neatly tied black hair, and sharp, anxious brown eyes that darted around the room as if fearing shadows that weren't there. Her rough hands, calloused from years of scrubbing and cleaning, clutched the strap of her worn handbag so tightly her knuckles paled. She had worked for the Thornton family for nearly 15 years, cleaning their sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, and her loyalty to them was widely known. But today, her eyes held no loyalty, only fear. "Senor Williams," Maria began softly, her Spanish accent evident, though her English was steady. "I should not be here, but I cannot stay silent." She glanced toward Liam, then at Grace, and finally at Hope, her lips trembling. Williams crossed his arms, his voice gentle but firm. "Maria, take your time. What's this about?" She swallowed hard, her gaze flicking toward the window, as though afraid someone might be watching. "The baby," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "She is not missing." "She was never missing." Liam's jaw clenched. His voice came out low, rough. "Say it straight, Maria." Maria inhaled shakily, lowering her voice until it was barely more than a whisper. "She is Rebecca's daughter." The room fell silent. Grace's breath caught audibly, and she instinctively tightened her hold on Hope's small hand. Liam's brows furrowed deeply, his entire body going rigid as he processed the words. "Rebecca Thornton?" Grace asked, disbelief lacing her tone. "The mayor's daughter?" Maria nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "See, 3 years ago, she had a baby. But there was no wedding, no husband. The family said she had gone east to study, but that was a lie. They hid her. When the baby came, they told her the little girl had died during childbirth." Her voice cracked then, her hands trembling as she twisted the strap of her bag. But it was not true. William stepped forward slowly, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. "You're saying the mayor knew?" Maria's lips tightened, and she nodded once, sharply. "Mayor Thornton hired a man, paid him to take the baby away. He said, 'Better dead than a scandal.'" She covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sob. "I heard him! I was there!" Liam's fists curled at his sides, his breathing ragged, anger burning hot in his veins. "He tried to have her killed," he muttered, his voice dark, shaking with fury. Rex, sensing his master's rage, rose to his feet, his ears forward and teeth just barely exposed. Grace's hazel eyes brimmed with tears, but her voice carried a quiet steel. "And Rebecca? Does she know?" Maria shook her head, shame flashing across her face. "No, she believes her daughter died. She cries still every night. I hear her through the walls." For a long moment, no one spoke. The ticking clock on the wall became deafening in the silence. Liam finally exhaled sharply, his jaw working as he struggled to control the storm raging inside him. "Then we keep her safe," he said firmly, his voice hoarse but resolute. "Whatever it takes." Grace looked at him, her hazel eyes soft but determined. She nodded once, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "We protect her," she whispered, stroking Hope's tiny hand. William straightened his shoulders, his voice lowering as he spoke. "We need to be smart about this. If Thornton learns she's alive, he'll come for her, and he has the power to make this disappear. But we're not going to let him." Maria sniffled quietly, clasping her hands together. "I will help," she said, her voice shaking but filled with conviction. "I know things. Things about the mayor. I can give you proof." Liam nodded once, his expression grim but steady. He reached down and rested a hand lightly on Rex's head, grounding himself in the familiar weight of his loyal companion. Outside the clinic window, snow drifted lazily to the ground, soft and silent, a stark contrast to the storm building inside the room. For Liam, for Grace, and for the little girl sleeping beneath the blanket, one thing was certain. The quiet life they had known was over. From this moment forward, Hope's survival depended on their strength, and none of them intended to back down. The storm came, not with thunder or lightning, but in the sound of expensive shoes clicking across the polished floor of Dr. Stone's clinic. The door opened, and Mayor Richard Thornton stepped inside, his presence filling the small room like a wave of tension. At 56, Thornton carried himself with the authority of a man used to getting what he wanted. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his once dark hair now a polished silver that matched his sharp steel-gray eyes. He wore a tailored charcoal suit beneath a black wool coat, a deep maroon silk tie knotted perfectly at his throat, and expensive leather gloves gripped tightly in one hand. His expression was carved in stone, his jaw rigid, lips pressed into a thin line, radiating an aura of control and quiet menace. People in Silver Creek described him as charming when he needed to be, ruthless when he didn't, and it was the latter man who stood in the doorway now. Behind him, Rebecca Thornton followed hesitantly, her slender frame seeming fragile compared to her father's towering presence. She was 24, pale-skinned, with soft, delicate features and long, chestnut-brown hair cascading in loose waves over her shoulders. But the hollowness in her hazel-green eyes betrayed years of being controlled and manipulated. She wore a cream-colored wool coat, buttoned to the throat, her hands clutching the edges tightly, as though bracing herself for what was to come. Grace Harper stood beside the examination table where Hope sat, bundled in blankets, her blonde curls tangled, but her breathing steady. As the door opened, Hope startled and instinctively turned toward Grace, her tiny fingers gripping Grace's sleeve tightly. Rex, the 5-year-old German shepherd, immediately rose from his position near Liam's boots, his large frame tense, tail stiff, ears pricked forward, and a low, warning growl vibrating from his chest. Mr. Hart, Mayor Thornton began, his deep voice smooth but laced with steel, I believe you have something that belongs to my family. Liam straightened, his blue-gray eyes narrowing slightly as he stepped subtly in front of the table. He was still dressed in his worn flannel shirt and faded jeans, his boots damp from the slush outside, but the quiet authority in his stance rivaled the mayor's. If you're talking about the little girl, he said evenly, I found her left to die in a sack by Miller's Creek. She belongs where she's safe. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out. Her gaze fell on Hope, and her chest visibly rose and fell, ragged with suppressed emotion. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Please, please let me hold her. Grace hesitated, exchanging a brief look with Liam before lowering her gaze to Hope. She crouched to the child's level, her soft voice soothing. It's okay, sweetheart. There's someone here who wants to meet you. But the moment Grace gently tried to place Hope into Rebecca's arms, the little girl stiffened, her tiny face crumpling before she erupted into heart-wrenching sobs. Her cries were high-pitched and panicked, her small fists clutching Grace's sweater desperately. Rebecca froze, stunned, her own eyes filling with tears. She doesn't know me, she whispered hoarsely, stepping back slightly as her father's cold expression flickered with irritation. Mayor Thornton's jaw tightened. This is exactly why she needs to be with her rightful family, he said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. You've had her for a few days. We've raised Rebecca for 24 years. We know how to provide, how to educate, how to ensure her future. She belongs with us. Belongs? Liam's voice came out harder than he intended, the word edged with anger. With a man who paid someone to throw her into a creek like garbage? His tone was low, but every syllable landed like a hammer. For a moment, the mayor's steel-gray eyes burned with suppressed fury. Be very careful what you accuse me of, Mr. Hart, he warned, his tone suddenly icy. If you think you can stand between my family and my granddaughter, you'll regret it. Rex stepped closer, standing between Liam and the mayor, his low growl deepening as his amber eyes locked on Thornton's every move. Grace placed a calming hand on Hope's back, rocking her gently, while Rebecca wiped at her tears, her voice trembling as she finally spoke louder. Papa, stop, she said softly, though her words carried unexpected weight. This isn't right. None of this is right. The mayor glanced at his daughter sharply, his expression darkening. Enough, Rebecca, he said through clenched teeth, his voice quiet but laced with threat. She lowered her gaze, retreating into silence, her knuckles whitening around her coat. It was Sheriff Paul Williams who finally broke the standoff, stepping forward with deliberate calm. His presence, steady and grounded, shifted the energy of the room. That's enough, both of you, he said firmly, his baritone voice resonating with authority. We're not going to settle this here in a shouting match. There are procedures, and if you want custody, Mr. Thornton, you'll have to do it the legal way. The mayor turned to face the sheriff, his sharp features softening into an icy smile. Fine, he said smoothly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored coat. If that's what it takes, then that's what we'll do. His gaze swept over Liam, lingering just long enough to make his meaning clear. But understand this, I will not lose. With that, he placed a protective hand on Rebecca's shoulder and steered her toward the door. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Hope with tear-filled eyes, before allowing herself to be led away. The door closed behind them, and silence settled over the clinic, thick and suffocating. Hope sniffled softly, pressing her small face into Grace's chest, her tiny hands still fisting her doll's worn fabric. Liam exhaled slowly, his body tense, jaw tight, the echo of the confrontation hanging in the air like smoke. Sheriff Williams spoke after a moment, his voice quiet but resolute. It's not over, he said, meeting Liam's gaze directly. Thornton's going to take this to court. Liam nodded grimly, his roughened hands resting on Rex's head. Then we'll be ready, he said, his voice low but steady. Grace glanced down at Hope, brushing the damp curls from her forehead, her expression soft yet fiercely protective. She's not going back to them, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Not after what they did. William sighed, his face lined deeper by the weight of what lay ahead. I'll file the paperwork first thing in the morning, but you need to prepare yourselves. Thornton's money, influence, and reputation run deep in this town. Liam's gaze hardened, his voice steady with conviction. I don't care if he owns the whole damn county. he said quietly, pulling Rex closer. "She's not going anywhere." Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the streets of Silver Creek in a deceptive calm. Inside the clinic, however, the war had just begun, and everyone in the room knew it. The courthouse in Silver Creek was unusually crowded that morning, the worn wooden benches filled with townsfolk murmuring in anticipation. Outside, the cold wind rattled the frosted windows, but inside the tension was palpable, thick as smoke. Liam Hart sat at the plaintiff's table beside Grace Harper, their hands folded tightly, the weight of the past weeks etched across their tired faces. Liam wore a clean plaid shirt under his weathered jacket, his posture straight but rigid, his jawline tense and unyielding. Grace sat to his right, her chestnut brown hair tied neatly into a braid, her hazel eyes soft yet filled with quiet steel. On the floor beside Liam, Rex, the 5-year-old German shepherd, rested calmly, his black and tan fur brushed smooth, his amber eyes alert, watching everyone who passed by with quiet suspicion. Across the aisle, Mayor Richard Thornton sat at the defense table, his commanding presence as sharp as ever. He wore a tailored navy suit and a silver tie, his hair perfectly combed back, his cold gray eyes fixed forward. His hand rested on a gold-tipped cane, more for appearance than necessity, and beside him sat Daniel Crowley, his lead attorney, a man well known across the state for defending high-profile clients. Crowley, in his early 50s, was lean and sharp-faced, his graying hair slicked back, his piercing dark eyes always calculating. He wore a perfectly pressed charcoal suit and spoke with a calm, deliberate cadence that masked the ruthlessness beneath his polished veneer. Rumor in Silver Creek was that Crowley had never lost a custody battle, and Thornton intended to use every advantage his money and influence could buy. At the judge's bench sat Judge Howard Parker, a man in his early 60s with thinning white hair and deep-set brown eyes, his lined face carrying the weight of decades on the bench. Known for his sense of fairness, he was respected by both sides of town politics. He adjusted his glasses as he looked over the docket, his voice measured as he called the case. "Case number 2145, Judge Parker announced, his tone steady. "Thornton versus Hart and Harper, custody of the minor child known as Hope." The murmurs in the room died instantly. Grace's hand found Liam's under the table, her grip warm but trembling slightly. Liam gave it a light squeeze, his gaze fixed on the judge, his expression calm but resolute. Daniel Crowley stood first, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the podium. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter," he began, his voice smooth and confident. "My client, Mayor Richard Thornton, seeks to restore his granddaughter, Hope Thornton, to her rightful family. The child was removed from her birth mother, Rebecca Thornton, under tragic miscommunications at the time of birth. Once the truth surfaced, my client acted immediately to reunite the family. It is in the child's best interest to grow up in an environment where she can receive proper care, education, and security, one my client is more than capable of providing." Grace glanced at Rebecca, who sat silently behind her father, her pale face drawn, her long chestnut hair falling forward as she stared at her clasped hands. There was no confidence in her posture, only quiet shame and sorrow. When Crowley finished, Tom Bradley, Liam and Grace's attorney, rose from his seat. Tom was in his late 40s, a local lawyer who usually handled land disputes and small claims, not cases of this magnitude. He was an unassuming man with sandy brown hair, slightly wrinkled suit jackets, and kind green eyes behind simple wire-rimmed glasses. But while he lacked Crowley's polish, he possessed an unwavering belief in fairness and integrity, and that passion carried into every word he spoke. "Your Honor," Tom began, his voice firm, though quieter than Crowley's, "my clients didn't seek out this fight. Liam Hart found a 3-year-old child stuffed into a burlap sack and thrown into Miller's Creek like trash. He rescued her, cared for her, and alongside Grace Harper, provided safety, warmth, and love. The question here isn't about who has more money, more power, or a bigger house. It's about where this little girl, Hope, is thriving, where she is safe, and where she is loved." The courtroom hushed, and Judge Parker nodded for the first witness to be called. Tom stood. The plaintiffs call Maria Gonzalez to the stand. Maria entered timidly, her petite frame trembling slightly as she approached the witness chair. Dressed simply in a faded gray cardigan over a modest floral dress, she clutched her hands together tightly. Her dark eyes scanned the room, lingering on Rebecca before dropping to the floor as she was sworn in. "Mrs. Gonzalez," Tom began gently, "how long have you been employed by the Thornton family?" 15 years, Maria said softly, her voice carrying her Spanish accent. "I clean the house, prepare meals, take care of everything." "And during your employment, did you witness conversations regarding the child now known as Hope?" Maria hesitated, glancing nervously at Thornton, whose jaw clenched imperceptibly. After a long breath, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I was there when the mayor told his assistant to take the baby away. He said no one could know Rebecca had a child. He said it would ruin everything." Her voice cracked slightly, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I heard him give money to a man to make her disappear." Crowley rose immediately. "Objection, hearsay." Judge Parker lifted a hand. "Overruled. Continue." Maria twisted her hands together. "I wanted to tell Rebecca, but they said the baby had died. She cried for weeks, senor. She believed her daughter was gone." The courtroom fell into silence, heavy and thick, broken only when Tom softly thanked Maria and stepped back. Next, Rebecca was called to the stand. Her pale hands trembled as she swore in, her hazel green eyes glassy with unshed tears. Tom's voice remained gentle. "Rebecca, when you gave birth to Hope, what were you told?" Rebecca's lips quivered, and she glanced briefly at her father before lowering her gaze. They told me she died," she whispered. "I wasn't allowed to hold her, not even once. I screamed, begged, but Papa said she was gone. I thought," her voice broke as sobs racked her slight frame, "I thought she was dead." Tom paused to let her gather herself. "And now that you know the truth, what do you want for her?" Rebecca's hazel green eyes lifted toward the bench, then darted toward Grace and Liam. Her voice trembled but held clarity for the first time. "I want her safe. I want her happy. I never wanted this." When she stepped down, Grace's eyes glistened, but she kept her composure, gently stroking Hope's soft blonde curls where she sat quietly on the bench, clinging to her worn doll. Finally, Dr. Michael Stone was called. Tall, broad-shouldered, his white coat crisp against his dark slacks, he approached the stand with practiced confidence. Tom's voice was steady. "Doctor, can you speak to Hope's condition when Liam brought her in?" Dr. Stone nodded gravely. "She was hypothermic, malnourished, and severely dehydrated. If Liam hadn't found her when he did, she wouldn't have survived the hour. Since staying with Mr. Hart and Miss Harper, she's stabilized, gained weight, and is showing signs of emotional attachment and development appropriate for her age. From a medical perspective, removing her from the only consistent, safe environment she's had would be traumatic." Tom smiled faintly, thanking the doctor, and returned to his table. Crowley rose quickly for cross-examination. But before he could speak, a soft, fragile sound broke the silence. Hope's tiny voice. She tugged at Liam's sleeve, holding up her doll with one hand, and whispered, "Papa." The word carried across the hushed courtroom like a bell tolling in the cold. Then she reached toward Grace with her other hand and murmured, "Mama." A hush fell over the room. Rebecca covered her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks, while even Judge Parker sat still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. In that instant, there were no more arguments, no clever words, no strategies, only truth, raw and undeniable. The judge finally leaned forward, folding his hands slowly. "Court is adjourned for today," he said softly. "We reconvene tomorrow." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of snow tapping gently against the tall windows, as though the entire town of Silver Creek held its breath. Judge Howard Parker leaned forward, his deep-set brown eyes calm, but weighted with the gravity of his decision. He removed his glasses slowly, setting them on the bench before clasping his hands together. The tension between the two tables was palpable. On one side sat Liam Hart and Grace Harper, their fingers interlaced tightly, with little Hope nestled between them, clutching her worn doll and Rex's leash loosely in her tiny hand. On the other side, Mayor Richard Thornton sat rigid and stone-faced, his lead attorney Daniel Crowley whispering frantically at his ear, but the mayor's jaw was locked tight, his gray eyes fixed forward, unblinking. Behind him, Rebecca Thornton sat, shoulders hunched, hands clasped together in her lap, her long chestnut brown hair falling in loose strands that framed her pale, trembling face. Judge Parker's voice finally cut through the silence, measured but unwavering. This court has considered every testimony, every piece of evidence, and above all else, the best interests of the child. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the packed gallery where townsfolk leaned forward on worn benches, their faces tense with anticipation. It is the judgment of this court that legal custody of the minor child, known as Hope, be granted to Mr. Liam Hart and Miss Grace Harper. Gasps rippled across the room, followed by hushed whispers. Grace brought a hand to her mouth as tears welled in her hazel eyes, her shoulders shaking with relief. Liam exhaled a deep, unsteady breath, his hands resting protectively on Hope's tiny frame. Rex, sensing the shift in emotion, nudged his nose against Hope's leg softly, his tail thumping once against the floor before returning to its poised, watchful stance. Judge Parker raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, he continued, his voice steady, Miss Rebecca Thornton is granted visitation rights and the opportunity to establish a gradual reunification plan if, and only if, she demonstrates the emotional and practical capacity to care for her child in the future. He turned his gaze toward Rebecca, his expression softening just slightly. You were deceived. This court acknowledges that, but rebuilding trust will take time and effort. Rebecca nodded shakily, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, Thank you, Your Honor, her voice breaking under the weight of both grief and hope. Finally, Judge Parker's expression hardened as his attention shifted to the mayor. As for Mayor Richard Thornton, he said, his tone deepening, this court is forwarding all testimony and evidence related to the circumstances surrounding the child's abandonment to the district attorney's office. There will be an investigation into allegations of conspiracy to commit harm against a minor. The reaction was immediate. Thornton's gray eyes widened for the briefest moment, though his composure returned as quickly as it faltered. Crowley leaned toward him, whispering furiously, but the mayor brushed him off, his face locked in a mask of cold disdain. The once untouchable man of Silver Creek had just been stripped of his control in front of his entire town. Judge Parker lifted his gavel, its polished wood glinting under the warm light streaming from the chandeliers above. This court is adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed across the chamber like a gunshot, marking the moment everything changed. For a heartbeat, the room was still, and then it erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically while townsfolk whispered among themselves. Grace bent down, pulling Hope into her arms, pressing her lips to the little girl's forehead as tears of joy rolled freely down her cheeks. Liam reached out, resting his hand gently on Grace's back, his other hand ruffling Hope's soft blonde curls as she giggled faintly, though her voice was still timid in the overwhelming room. Rex, finally relaxing, sat upright beside them, his ears perked proudly as though he somehow understood his role in all of this. Rebecca approached slowly, her pale hands twisting nervously in front of her. Her steps were hesitant, her hazel green eyes glossy with vulnerability as she stopped a few feet from Liam and Grace. I just wanted to say thank you, she whispered softly, her voice unsteady but genuine, for saving her, for loving her the way I couldn't. Grace reached out, touching Rebecca's arm lightly, her voice calm but warm. Hope has a home now, she said softly, but she'll know her mother's story. She deserves that. Rebecca nodded silently, her tears flowing freely now, before glancing down at Hope, who peeked out shyly from Grace's shoulder. Hope hesitated for a moment, then whispered one word, soft but certain. Mama? Though directed at Grace, Rebecca smiled faintly through her tears, knowing it would take time, maybe years, but one day perhaps, Hope would call her the same. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd gathered, waiting for the outcome. When Liam, Grace, Hope, and Rex stepped out into the cold winter sunlight, the crowd erupted into applause, the sound ringing against the brick walls of Silver Creek's historic square. People approached, some shaking Liam's hand, others crouching to pat Rex's sturdy shoulders. Word of his barking at the creek, leading Liam to the sack that saved Hope's life, had spread quickly. To the townsfolk, Rex wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a hero. That evening, back at Liam's cabin on the edge of the woods, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, filling the small home with warmth. Hope sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a soft blanket, her doll clutched close as Rex lay protectively at her feet. Grace moved quietly through the kitchen, brewing tea, while Liam sat nearby, watching the flames dance and flicker, his shoulders finally relaxing for the first time in years. There was no certainty about the future. Thornton's investigation would take time, Rebecca's healing would take longer. But tonight, inside the little wooden cabin, the air carried something Liam thought he'd lost forever. Peace. For the first time since Miller's Creek, they weren't fighting to survive. They were living. And that was enough. The gentle spring breeze carried the sound of church bells through the heart of Silver Creek, washing over the streets that had once been filled with tension and whispers. It had been 1 year since the courtroom battle that changed everything, and life in the small mountain town had slowly settled into a quiet rhythm of peace. At the edge of town, Liam Hart stood in front of the modest white church, his hands clasped loosely as he watched Hope twirl on the stone path, her soft blonde curls bouncing with each clumsy spin. At 4 years old, she had grown stronger and healthier, her pale cheeks now rosy, her blue eyes bright with life. In one tiny hand, she clutched her beloved rag doll, its seams carefully stitched back together by Grace, and on the other, she held a small basket filled with wildflowers she had picked herself. Inside the church, Grace Harper adjusted her simple ivory dress, her chestnut brown hair braided neatly over one shoulder. Her hazel eyes reflected both calm and quiet joy, though her hands fidgeted slightly as she straightened the hem of her skirt. After years of living in quiet solitude, she was about to marry the man who had unknowingly carried the missing pieces of her heart, and the little girl who had bound them together. In the pews, the townsfolk filled the small chapel, their faces familiar and warm. Sheriff Paul Williams sat near the aisle, his weathered Stetson resting on his knee, his deep brown eyes softer than usual as he smiled faintly at Hope's playful antics. Behind him, Dr. Michael Stone leaned back in the pew, his broad frame relaxed for once, his hands folded neatly across his lap. At his side sat his wife, Margaret, a tall woman with short auburn hair and kind gray eyes, who had helped organize the ceremony with her steady, meticulous nature. The music began softly, a simple piano melody played by Eleanor Briggs, the town's retired music teacher, a petite woman with silver hair and delicate wire-frame glasses. Her frail fingers, though shaky with age, danced across the keys with practiced grace. Hope, standing near the entrance, clutched her basket tightly and glanced up at Liam, who knelt beside her. "Ready, Peanut?" he whispered, his blue-gray eyes warm and steady. Hope nodded fiercely, though her tiny lips pressed together in concentration. The doors opened, and the little girl began her careful walk down the aisle, tossing petals from her basket one by one. The congregation smiled, murmurs of soft laughter rising, when Rex, now 6 years old, padded proudly behind her. The German shepherd's thick black and tan fur gleamed under the soft light streaming through the stained glass windows, and a bright red bow was tied loosely around his neck. Each time Hope dropped a petal, Rex lowered his head and sniffed it curiously before trotting after her, earning delighted chuckles from the entire church. When Grace stepped into the aisle, Liam's breath caught in his throat. For years, his world had been haunted by shadows. The loss of his comrades, the collapse of his marriage, the grief of a daughter he thought he'd lost. But in that moment, standing at the altar watching Grace walk toward him, his heart was unburdened. Her soft smile reached him like sunlight piercing through dark clouds, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Liam let himself believe in something better than survival. As Grace reached the altar, Hope squeezed herself between them, holding one small hand out to Liam and the other to Grace. The pastor, a gentle man named Reverend Samuel Hayes, stood tall in his simple black robe, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his deep-set green eyes calm and warm. Known for his kindness and steady guidance, he had led the small church for nearly 20 years, earning the respect of everyone in town. "Today," Reverend Hayes began, his voice resonant and steady, "we celebrate not just the joining of Liam and Grace, but the story that brought us all here, a story of resilience, of forgiveness, and of a love that chose family over fear. The vows were simple, quiet, and full of meaning. Liam's roughened hands trembled slightly as he slipped a modest silver ring onto Grace's finger, his blue-gray eyes softening as he whispered his promise. "You and Hope, you saved me." Grace's lips quivered as she replied, "No, Liam, we saved each other." When Reverend Hayes finally declared them husband and wife, the church erupted into applause. Hope squealed with laughter, launching herself into Liam's arms, and Rex barked once, loud and triumphant, causing the congregation to burst into laughter. In that moment, under the soft glow of the stained glass, they weren't survivors anymore. They were a family. Later that afternoon, the townsfolk gathered outside in the small square for a celebration. Wooden tables lined with pies, warm bread, and steaming mugs of cider filled the open space. Children darted between the legs of adults, tossing petals left over from the ceremony, while the older folks leaned back in folding chairs, watching the festivities unfold. In a quieter corner near the fountain, Rebecca Thornton knelt on one knee, her cream-colored sundress catching the breeze as she reached out to Hope. A year had softened Rebecca's delicate features. Her pale cheeks were fuller now, and there was a light in her hazel-green eyes that hadn't been there before. She smiled gently as Hope ran into her arms, giggling. "Hi, Aunt Becca," the little girl chirped brightly, the nickname flowing naturally, born from months of careful introductions and trust, rebuilt one visit at a time. Rebecca kissed the crown of Hope's head softly, her voice catching as she whispered, "Hi, baby girl." Her gaze lifted briefly to Liam and Grace across the square, offering them a small, grateful smile, one they both returned without hesitation. Not far from the joyful chaos, Sheriff Williams stood with two uniformed deputies, speaking in low, serious tones as reporters scribbled notes nearby. Earlier that week, Carl Jenkins, the man who had accepted money from Mayor Thornton to discard Hope in Miller's Creek, had been arrested after months of investigation. Jenkins, a burly man in his 40s with a weathered face, thick beard, and a history of petty crimes, had confessed everything during questioning. His testimony had been key in forcing Thornton's resignation as mayor, ending decades of political dominance. The once powerful Richard Thornton now faced formal charges of conspiracy and child endangerment. Stripped of his office and influence, he retreated into isolation, leaving Rebecca free to begin rebuilding her life without his shadow looming over her. As the sun dipped low, the celebration wound down. Back at the little cabin near the woods, the hearth glowed warmly, casting flickering light across the small living room. Hope sat cross-legged on the rug, arranging petals into uneven piles, while Rex lay curled beside her, his head resting on his paws, occasionally nudging a stray petal closer with his nose. Grace leaned against Liam on the couch, their shoulders touching, their silence soft and content. Liam glanced across the room at the little girl who had changed everything. He rose, crossing the floor, and knelt beside Hope, pulling her gently into his arms. She yawned sleepily, resting her head against his shoulder, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. He kissed her temple softly, his voice low and rough with emotion, as he whispered, "Home is where we found each other." The crackle of the fire filled the quiet space, and for the first time in a long, long while, Liam knew exactly where he belonged. Sometimes, God places the right people, and even the right dogs, in our path. Not by chance, but by grace. When Liam walked by Miller's Creek that freezing morning, he didn't know he was stepping into the greatest miracle of his life. Hope was not just a little girl found in a burlap sack. She was a reminder that God never abandons us, even when the world seems darkest. Through pain, loss, and battles we never asked for, there is always a thread of divine love guiding us home. Family isn't always bound by blood. It's bound by the love God plants in our hearts. And sometimes, what looks like tragedy is only the beginning of a story filled with healing, redemption, and second chances. If you believe God sends us miracles when we least expect them, say amen in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs hope today, and let them know that faith can change everything. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of courage, love, and God's grace. May God bless you and your family, and may His light guide you, just as He guided Liam, Grace, Rex, and little Hope to one another. Together, let's spread faith, kindness, and miracles to the world.